Chapter 22. Total Failure of Water. This time the descent commenced by the new gallery. Hans walked first, as was his custom. We had not gone 100 yards, and the professor, moving his lantern along the walls, cried, "Here are primitive rocks. Now we are in the right way. Forward!" When in its early stages the earth was slowly cooling, its contraction gave rise in its crust to disruptions, distortions, fissures, and chasms. The passage through which we were moving was such a fissure, through which at one time granite poured out in a molten state. Its thousands of windings formed an inextricable labyrinth through the primeval mass. As fast as we descended, the succession of beds forming the primitive foundation came out with increasing distinctness. Geologists consider this primitive matter to be the base of the mineral crust of the earth, and have ascertained it to be composed of 3 different formations: schist, gneiss, and mica schist, resting upon that unchangeable foundation, the granite. Never had mineralogists found themselves in so marvellous a situation to study nature in situ. What the boring machine, an insensible, inert instrument, was unable to bring to the surface of the inner structure of the globe, we were able to peruse with our own eyes and handle with our own hands. Through the beds of schist coloured with delicate shades of green ran in winding coarse threads of copper and manganese with traces of platinum and gold. I thought, what riches are here buried at an unapproachable depth in the earth, hidden for ever from the covetous eyes of the human race. These treasures have been buried at such a profound depth by the convulsions of primeval times that they run no chance of ever being molested by the pickaxe or the spade. To the schists succeeded gneiss, partially stratified, remarkable for the parallelism and regularity of its lamina, then mica schists laid in large plates or flakes, revealing their lamellated structure by the sparkle of their white shining mica. The light from our apparatus, reflected from the small facets of quartz, shot sparkling rays at every angle, and I seemed to be moving through a diamond within which the quickly darting rays broke across each other in 1,000 flashing coruscations. About 6 o'clock, this brilliant fete of illuminations underwent a sensible abatement of splendour, then almost ceased. The walls assumed a crystallized though sombre appearance. Mica was more closely mingled with the feldspar and quartz to form the proper rocky foundations of the earth, which bears without distortion or crushing the weight of the 4 terrestrial systems. We were immured within prison walls of granite. It was 8 in the evening. No signs of water had yet appeared. I was suffering horribly. My uncle strode on. He refused to stop. He was listening anxiously for the murmur of distant springs. But no, there was dead silence. And now my limbs were failing beneath me. I resisted pain and torture, that I might not stop my uncle, which would have driven him to despair, for the day was drawing near to its end, and it was his last. At last I failed utterly. I uttered a cry and fell. "Come to me, I am dying." My uncle retraced his steps. He gazed upon me with his arms crossed, then these muttered words passed his lips. "It's all over." The last thing I saw was a fearful gesture of rage, and my eyes closed. When I reopened them, I saw my 2 companions motionless and rolled up in their coverings. Were they asleep? As for me, I could not get 1 moment's sleep. I was suffering too keenly, and what embittered my thoughts was that there was no remedy. My uncle's last words echoed painfully in my ears. "It's all over." For in such a fearful state of debility, it was madness to think of ever reaching the upper world again. We had above us 1.5 leagues of terrestrial crust. The weight of it seemed to be crushing down upon my shoulders. I felt weighed down, and I felt exhausted with imaginary violent exertions to turn round upon my granite couch. A few hours passed away. A deep silence reigned around us, the silence of the grave. No sound could reach us through walls, the thinnest of which were 5 miles thick. Yet in the midst of my stupefaction I seemed to be aware of a noise. It was dark down the tunnel, but I seemed to see the Icelander vanishing from our sight with the lamp in his hand. Why was he leaving us? Was Hans going to forsake us? My uncle was fast asleep. I wanted to shout, but my voice dried upon my parched and swollen lips. The darkness became deeper, and the last sound died away in the far distance. "Hans has abandoned us," I cried. "Hans, Hans." But these words were only spoken within me. They went no farther. Yet after the first moment of terror, I felt ashamed of suspecting a man of such extraordinary faithfulness. Instead of ascending, he was descending the gallery. An evil design would have taken him up, not down. This reflection restored me to calmness, and I turned to other thoughts. None but some weighty motive could have induced so quiet a man to forfeit his sleep. Was he on a journey of discovery? Had he, during the silence of the night, caught a sound, a murmuring of something in the distance which had failed to affect my hearing? Chapter 23. Water Discovered. For a whole hour I was trying to work out in my delirious brain the reasons which might have influenced this seemingly tranquil huntsman. The absurdest notions ran in utter confusion through my mind. I thought madness was coming on. But at last a noise of footsteps was heard in the dark abyss. Hans was approaching. A flickering light was beginning to glimmer on the wall of our darksome prison. Then it came out full at the mouth of the gallery. Hans appeared. He drew close to my uncle, laid his hand upon his shoulder, and gently woke him. My uncle rose up. "What is the matter?" he asked. "Warten," replied the huntsman. No doubt under the inspiration of intense pain everybody becomes endowed with the gift of divers tongues. I did not know a word of Danish, yet instinctively I understood the word he had uttered. "Water! Water!" I cried, clapping my hands and gesticulating like a madman. "Water!" repeated my uncle. "Where?" he asked in Icelandic. "Nedat," replied Hans. "Where? Down below?" I understood it all. I seized the hunter's hands and pressed them while he looked on me without moving a muscle of his countenance. The preparations for our departure were not long in making, and we were soon on our way down a passage inclining 2 feet in 7. In an hour we had gone 1.25 miles and descended 2,000 feet. Then I began to hear distinctly quite a new sound of something running within the thickness of the granite wall, a kind of dull, dead rumbling like distant thunder. During the first part of our walk, not meeting with the promised spring, I felt my agony returning, but then my uncle acquainted me with the cause of the strange noise. "Hans was not mistaken," he said. "What you hear is the rushing of a torrent." "A torrent?" I exclaimed. "There can be no doubt. A subterranean river is flowing around us." We hurried forward in the greatest excitement. I was no longer sensible of my fatigue. This murmuring of waters close at hand was already refreshing me. It was audibly increasing. The torrent, after having for some time flowed over our heads, was now running within the left wall, roaring and rushing. Frequently I touched the wall, hoping to feel some indications of moisture, but there was no hope here. Yet another half hour, another half league was passed. Then it became clear that the hunter had gone no farther. Guided by an instinct peculiar to mountaineers, he had, as it were, felt this torrent through the rock, but he had certainly seen none of the precious liquid. He had drunk nothing himself. Soon it became evident that if we continued our walk we should widen the distance between ourselves and the stream, the noise of which was becoming fainter. We returned. Hans stopped where the torrent seemed closest. I sat near the wall while the waters were flowing past me at a distance of 2 feet with extreme violence, but there was a thick granite wall between us and the object of our desires. Without reflection, without asking if there were any means of procuring the water, I gave way to a movement of despair. Hans glanced at me with, I thought, a smile of compassion. He rose and took the lamp. I followed him. He moved towards the wall. I looked on. He applied his ear against the dry stone and moved it slowly to and fro, listening intently. I perceived at once that he was examining to find the exact place where the torrent could be heard the loudest. He met with that point on the left side of the tunnel, at 3 feet from the ground. I was stirred up with excitement. I hardly dared guess what the hunter was about to do, but I could not but understand and applaud and cheer him on, when I saw him lay hold of the pickaxe to make an attack upon the rock. "We are saved!" I cried. "Yes," cried my uncle, who was frantic with excitement. "Hans is right. Capital fellow. Who but he would have thought of it?" Yes, who but he? Such an expedient, however simple, would never have entered into our minds. True, it seemed most hazardous to strike a blow of the hammer in this part of the earth's structure. Suppose some displacement should occur and crush us all. Suppose the torrent, bursting through, should drown us in a sudden flood. There was nothing vain in these fancies, but still no fears of falling rocks or rushing floods could stay us now, and our thirst was so intense that, to satisfy it, we would have dared the waves of the North Atlantic. Hans set about the task which my uncle and I together could not have accomplished. If our impatience had armed our hands with power, we should have shattered the rock into 1,000 fragments. Not so Hans. Full of self-possession, he calmly wore his way through the rock with a steady succession of light and skilful strokes, working through an aperture 6 inches wide at the outside. I could hear a louder noise of flowing waters, and I fancied I could feel the delicious fluid refreshing my parched lips. The pick had soon penetrated 2 feet into the granite partition, and our man had worked for above an hour. I was in an agony of impatience. My uncle wanted to employ stronger measures, and I had some difficulty in dissuading him. Still, he had just taken a pickaxe in his hand when a sudden hissing was heard, and a jet of water spurted out with violence against the opposite wall. Hans, almost thrown off his feet by the violence of the shock, uttered a cry of grief and disappointment, of which I soon understood the cause. When plunging my hands into the spouting torrent, I withdrew them in haste, for the water was scalding hot. "The water is at the boiling point," I cried. "Well, never mind, let it cool," my uncle replied. The tunnel was filling with steam, whilst a stream was forming, which by degrees wandered away into subterranean windings, and soon we had the satisfaction of swallowing our first draught. Could anything be more delicious than the sensation that our burning, intolerable thirst was passing away, and leaving us to enjoy comfort and pleasure? But where was this water from? No matter, it was water, and though still warm, it brought life back to the dying. I kept drinking without stopping, and almost without tasting. At last, after a most delightful time of reviving energy, I cried, "Why, this is a chalybeate spring!" "Nothing could be better for the digestion," said my uncle. "It is highly impregnated with iron. It will be as good for us going to the spa, or to Toplitz." "Well, it is delicious." "Of course it is. Water should be found 6 miles underground. It has an inky flavour, which is not at all unpleasant. What a capital source of strength Hans has found for us here. We will call it after his name." "Agreed," I cried. And Hansbach it was from that moment. Hans was none the prouder. After a moderate draught, he went quickly into a corner to rest. "Now," I said, "we must not lose this water." "What is the use of troubling ourselves?" my uncle replied. "I fancy it will never fail." "Never mind, we cannot be sure. Let us fill the water bottle and our flasks, and then stop up the opening." My advice was followed so far as getting in a supply, but the stopping up of the hole was not so easy to accomplish. It was in vain that we took up fragments of granite and stuffed them in with tow. We only scalded our hands without succeeding. The pressure was too great, and our efforts were fruitless. "It is quite plain," said I, "that the higher body of this water is at a considerable elevation. The force of the jet shows that." "No doubt," answered my uncle. "If this column of water is 32,000 feet high, that is, from the surface of the earth, it is equal to the weight of 1,000 atmospheres. But I have got an idea." "Well?" "Why should we trouble ourselves to stop the stream from coming out at all?" "Because, well, I could not assign a reason." "When our flasks are empty, where shall we fill them again? Can we tell that?" No, there was no certainty. "Well, let us allow the water to run on. It will flow down and will both guide and refresh us." "That is well planned," I cried. "With this stream for our guide, there is no reason why we should not succeed in our undertaking." "Ah, my boy, you agree with me now," cried the professor, laughing. "I agree with you most heartily." "Well, let us rest a while, and then we shall start again." I was forgetting that it was night. The chronometer soon informed me of the fact, and in a very short time, refreshed and thankful, we all three fell into a sound sleep. Chapter 24. Well said, old mole. Canst thou work i' the ground so fast? By the next day we had forgotten all our sufferings. At first I was wondering that I was no longer thirsty, and I was asking for the reason. The answer came in the murmuring of the stream at my feet. We breakfasted and drank of this excellent chalybeate water. I felt wonderfully stronger, and quite decided upon pushing on. Why should not so firmly convinced a man as my uncle, furnished with so industrious a guide as Hans, and accompanied by so determined a nephew as myself, go on to final success? Such were the magnificent plans which struggled for mastery within me. If it had been proposed to return me to the summit of Snæfell, I should have indignantly declined. Most fortunately, all we had to do was to descend. "Let us start," I cried, awakening by my shouts the echoes of the vaulted hollows of the earth. On Thursday, at 8 a.m, we started afresh. The granite tunnel winding from side to side earned us past unexpected turns and seemed almost to form a labyrinth, but on the whole its direction seemed to be southeasterly. My uncle never ceased to consult his compass to keep account of the ground gone over. The gallery dipped down a very little way from the horizontal, scarcely more than 2 inches in a fathom, and the stream ran gently murmuring at our feet. I compared it to a friendly genius guiding us underground, and caressed with my hand the soft naiad whose comforting voice accompanied our steps. With my reviving spirits, these mythological notions seemed to come unbidden. As for my uncle, he was beginning to storm against the horizontal road. He loved nothing better than a vertical path, but this way seemed indefinitely prolonged, and instead of sliding along the hypotenuse as we were now doing, he would willingly have dropped down the terrestrial radius, but there was no help for it, and as long as we were approaching the centre at all, we felt that we must not complain. From time to time, a steeper path appeared. Our naiad then began to tumble before us with a hoarser murmur, and we went down with her to a greater depth. On the whole, that day and the next we made considerable way horizontally, very little vertically. On Friday evening, the 10th of July, according to our calculations, we were 30 leagues southeast of Reykjavik, at a depth of 2 leagues and a half. At our feet there now opened a frightful abyss. My uncle, however, was not to be daunted, and he clapped his hands at the steepness of the descent. "This will take us a long way," he cried, "and without much difficulty, for the projections in the rock form quite a staircase." The ropes were so fastened by hands as to guard against accident, and the descent commenced. I can hardly call it perilous, for I was beginning to be familiar with this kind of exercise. This well, or abyss, was a narrow cleft in the mass of the granite, called by geologists a fault, and caused by the unequal cooling of the globe of the earth. If it had at one time been a passage for eruptive matter thrown out by Snæfell, I still could not understand why no trace was left of its passage. We kept going down a kind of winding staircase which seemed almost to have been made by the hand of man. Every quarter of an hour we were obliged to halt, to take a little necessary repose and restore the action of our limbs. We then sat down upon a fragment of rock, and we talked as we ate and drank from the stream. Of course, down this fault the Hansbach fell in a cascade, and lost some of its volume, but there was enough and to spare to slake our thirst. Besides, when the incline became more gentle, it would of course resume its peaceable course. At this moment it reminded me of my worthy uncle, in his frequent fits of impatience and anger, while below it ran with the calmness of the Icelandic hunter. On the 11th and 12th of July we kept following the spiral curves of this singular well, penetrating in actual distance no more than 2 leagues, but being carried to a depth of 5 leagues below the level of the sea. But on the 13th, about noon, the fault took towards the southeast a much gentler slope, one of about 45 degrees. Then the road became monotonously easy. It could not be otherwise, for there was no landscape to vary the stages of our journey. On Wednesday, the 15th, we were 7 leagues underground and had travelled 50 leagues away from Snæfell. Although we were tired, our health was perfect, and the medicine chest had not yet had occasion to be opened. My uncle noted every hour the indications of the compass, the chronometer, the aneroid, and the thermometer, the very same which he has published in his scientific report of our journey. It was therefore not difficult to know exactly our whereabouts. When he told me that we had gone 50 leagues horizontally, I could not repress an exclamation of astonishment at the thought that we had now long left Iceland behind us. "What is the matter?" he cried. "I was reflecting that if your calculations are correct, we are no longer under Iceland." "Do you think so?" "I am not mistaken," I said, and examining the map I added, "We have passed Cape Portland, and those 50 leagues bring us under the wide expanse of ocean." "Under the sea?" my uncle repeated, rubbing his hands with delight. "Can it be?" I said. "Is the ocean spread above our heads?" "Of course, Axel. What can be more natural? At Newcastle are there not coal mines extending far under the sea?" It was all very well for the professor to call this so simple, but I could not feel quite easy at the thought that the boundless ocean was rolling over my head, and yet it really mattered very little whether it was the plains and mountains that covered our heads or the Atlantic waves, as long as we were arched over by solid granite. And besides, I was getting used to this idea, for the tunnel, now running straight, now winding as capriciously in its inclines as in its turnings, but constantly preserving its southeasterly direction, and always running deeper, was gradually carrying us to very great depths indeed. 4 days later, Saturday, the 18th of July, in the evening, we arrived at a kind of vast grotto, and here my uncle paid Hans his weekly wages, and it was settled that the next day, Sunday, should be a day of rest. Chapter 25. De Profundis. I therefore awoke next day relieved from the preoccupation of an immediate start, Although we were in the very deepest of known depths, there was something not unpleasant about it, and besides, we were beginning to get accustomed to this troglodyte life. I no longer thought of sun, moon and stars, trees, houses and towns, nor of any of those terrestrial superfluities which are necessities of men who live upon the earth's surface. Being fossils, we looked upon all those things as mere jokes. The grotto was an immense apartment. Along its granite floor ran our faithful stream. At this distance from its spring, the water was scarcely tepid, and we drank of it with pleasure. After breakfast, the professor gave a few hours to the arrangement of his daily notes. "First," said he, "I will make a calculation to ascertain our exact position. I hope after our return to draw a map of our journey, which will be in reality a vertical section of the globe, containing the track of our expedition." "That will be curious, uncle, but are your observations sufficiently accurate to enable you to do this correctly?" "Yes, I have everywhere observed the angles and the inclines. I am sure there is no error. Let us see where we are now. Take your compass and note the direction." I looked and replied carefully, "Southeast by east." "Well," answered the professor after a rapid calculation, "I infer that we have gone 85 leagues since we started. Therefore we are under the mid-Atlantic." "To be sure we are." "And perhaps at this very moment there is a storm above, and ships over our heads are being rudely tossed by the tempest." "Quite probable." "And whales are lashing the roof of our prison with their tails?" "It may be, Axel, but they won't shake us here. But let us go back to our calculation. Here we are, 85 leagues southeast of Snæfell, and I reckon that we are at a depth of 16 leagues. 16 leagues! I cried. "No doubt." "Why, this is the very limit assigned by science to the thickness of the crust of the earth." "I don't deny it." "And here, according to the law of increasing temperature, there ought to be a heat of 2,730 degrees Fahrenheit. "So there should be, my lad." "And all this solid granite ought to be running in fusion." "You see that it is not so, and that, as so often happens, facts come to overthrow theories." I am obliged to agree, but after all it is surprising." "What does the thermometer say?" 27 6/10 degrees Celsius, 82 degrees Fahrenheit. "Therefore the savants are wrong by 2,705 degrees, and the proportional increase is a mistake. Therefore Humphrey Davy was right, and I am not wrong in following him. What do you say now?" "Nothing. In truth, I had a good deal to say. I gave way in no respect to Davy's theory. I still held to the central heat, although I did not feel its effects. I preferred to admit in truth that this chimney of an extinct volcano, lined with lavas, which are non-conductors of heat, did not suffer the heat to pass through its walls. But without stopping to look up new arguments, I simply took up our situation as such as it was. "Well, admitting all your calculations to be quite correct, you must allow me to draw one rigid result therefrom." "What is it? Speak freely." "At the latitude of Iceland, where we now are, the radius of the Earth, the distance from the Earth to the surface, is about 1,583 leagues. Let us say in round numbers, 1,600 leagues, or 4,800 miles. Out of 1,600 leagues, we have gone 12. "So you say." "And these 12 are at a cost of 85 leagues diagonally." "Exactly so." "In 20 days?" "Yes." "Now, 16 leagues are the 100th part of the Earth's radius. At this rate, we shall be 2,000 days, or nearly 5 years and a half, in getting to the centre." No answer was vouchsafed to this rational conclusion. "Without reckoning, too, that if a vertical depth of 16 leagues can be attained only by a diagonal descent of 84, it follows that we must go 8,000 miles in a southeasterly direction, so that we shall emerge from some point in the Earth's circumference, instead of getting to the centre." "Confusion to all your figures, and all your hypotheses besides," shouted my uncle in a sudden rage. "What is the basis of them all? How do you know that this passage does not run straight to our destination? Besides, there is a precedent. What one man has done, another may do." "I hope so, but still, I may be permitted—" "You shall have my leave to hold your tongue, Axel, but not to talk in that irrational way." I could see the awful professor bursting through my uncle's skin, and I took timely warning. "Now, look at your aneroid. What does that say?" "It says we are under considerable pressure." "Very good. So you see that by going gradually down and getting accustomed to the density of the atmosphere, we don't suffer at all." Nothing, except a little pain in the ears. That's nothing, and you may get rid of even that by quick breathing whenever you feel the pain. Exactly so, I said, determined not to say a word that might cross my uncle's prejudices. There is even positive pleasure in living in this dense atmosphere. Have you observed how intense sound is down here? No doubt it is. A deaf man would soon learn to hear perfectly. But won't this density augment? Yes, according to a rather obscure law. It is well known that the weight of bodies diminishes as fast as we descend. You know that it is at the surface of the globe that weight is most sensibly felt, and that at the centre there is no weight at all. I'm aware of that, but tell me, will not air at last acquire the density of water? Of course, under a pressure of 710 atmospheres. And how, lower down still? Lower down, the density will still increase. But how shall we go down, then? Why, we must fill our pockets with stones. Well, indeed, my worthy uncle, you were never at a loss for an answer. I dared venture no farther into the region of probabilities, for I might presently have stumbled upon an impossibility which would have brought the Professor on the scene when he was not wanted. Still, it was evident that the air, under a pressure which might reach that of thousands of atmospheres, would at least reach the solid state, and then, even if our bodies could resist the strain, we should be stopped, and no reasonings would be able to get us any farther. But I did not advance this argument. My uncle would have met it with his inevitable saknussemm, a precedent which possessed no weight with me, for even if the journey of the learned Icelander was really attested, there was one very simple answer, that in the 16th century there was neither barometer or aneroid, and therefore saknussemm could not tell how far he had gone. But I kept this objection to myself, and waited the course of events. The rest of the day was passed in calculations and in conversations. I remained a steadfast adherent of the opinions of Professor Liedenbrock, and I envied the solid indifference of Hans, who, without getting into causes and effects, went on with his eyes shut wherever his destiny guided him. Chapter 26. The Worst Peril of All. It must be confessed that hitherto things had not gone on so badly, and that I had small reason to complain. If our difficulties became no worse, we might hope to reach our end, and to what a height of scientific glory we should then attain. I had become quite a Liedenbrock in my reasonings. Seriously, I had. But would this state of things last in the strange place we had come to? Perhaps it might. For several days, steeper inclines, some even frightfully near to the perpendicular, brought us deeper and deeper into the mass of the interior of the earth. Some days we advanced nearer to the centre by 1.5 leagues, or nearly 2 leagues. These were perilous descents, in which the skill and marvellous coolness of Hans were invaluable to us. That unimpassioned Icelander devoted himself with incomprehensible deliberation, and thanks to him we crossed many a dangerous spot which we should never have cleared alone. But his habit of silence gained upon him day by day, and was infecting us. External objects produced decided effects upon the brain. A man shut up between 4 walls soon loses the power to associate words and ideas together. How many prisoners in solitary confinement become idiots, if not mad, for want of exercise for the thinking faculty? During the fortnight following our last conversation, no incident occurred worthy of being recorded, but I have good reason for remembering one very serious event which took place at this time, and of which I could scarcely now forget the smallest details. By the 7th of August, our successive descents had brought us to a depth of 30 leagues. That is, that for a space of 30 leagues there were over our heads solid beds of rock, ocean, continents, and towns. We must have been 200 leagues from Iceland. On that day, the tunnel went down a gentle slope. I was ahead of the others. My uncle was carrying one of Ruhmkorff's lamps, and I the other. I was examining the beds of granite. Suddenly, turning round, I observed that I was alone. Well, well, I thought. I have been going too fast. Or Hans and my uncle have stopped on the way. Come, this won't do, I must join them. Fortunately, there is not much of an ascent. I retraced my steps. I walked for a quarter of an hour. I gazed into the darkness. I shouted. No reply. My voice was lost in the midst of the cavernous echoes which alone replied to my call. I began to feel uneasy. A shudder ran through me. Calmly, I said aloud to myself. I am sure to find my companions again. There are not 2 roads. I was too far ahead. I will return. For half an hour I climbed up. I listened for a call, and in that dense atmosphere a voice could reach very far, but there was a dreary silence in all that long gallery. I stopped. I could not believe that I was lost. I was only bewildered for a time, not lost. I was sure I should find my way again. Come, I repeated. Since there is but one road, and they are on it, I must find them again. I have but to ascend still. Unless, indeed, missing me and supposing me to be behind, they too should have gone back. But even in this case, I have only to make the greater haste. I shall find them, I am sure. I repeated these words in the fainter tones of a half-convinced man. Besides, to associate even such simple ideas with words and reason with them was a work of time. A doubt then seized upon me. Was I indeed in advance when we became separated? Yes, to be sure I was. Hans was after me, preceding my uncle. He had even stopped for a while to strap his baggage better over his shoulders. I could remember this little incident. It was at that very moment that I must have gone on. Besides, I thought, have not I a guarantee that I shall not lose my way, a clue in the labyrinth that cannot be broken, my faithful stream? I have but to trace it back, and I must come upon them. This conclusion revived my spirits, and I resolved to resume my march without loss of time. How I then blessed my uncle's foresight in preventing the hunter from stopping up the hole in the granite. This beneficent spring, having satisfied our thirst on the road, would now be my guide among the windings of the terrestrial crust. Before starting afresh, I thought a wash would do me good. I stooped to bathe my face in the Hansbach. To my stupefaction and utter dismay, my feet trod only the rough, dry granite. The stream was no longer at my feet. Chapter 27. Lost in the Bowels of the Earth. To describe my despair would be impossible. No words could tell it. I was buried alive, with the prospect before me of dying of hunger and thirst. Mechanically I swept the ground with my hands. How dry and hard the rock seemed to me. But how had I left the course of the stream? For it was a terrible fact that it no longer ran at my side. Then I understood the reason of that fearful silence when for the last time I listened to hear if any sound from my companions could reach my ears. At the moment when I left the right road, I had not noticed the absence of the stream. It is evident that at that moment a deviation had presented itself before me, whilst the Hansbach, following the caprice of another incline, had gone with my companions away into unknown depths. How was I to return? There was not a trace of their footsteps or of my own, for the foot left no mark upon the granite floor. I racked my brain for a solution of this impracticable problem. One word described my position. Lost. Lost at an immeasurable depth. 30 leagues of rock seemed to weigh upon my shoulders with a dreadful pressure. I felt crushed. I tried to carry back my ideas to things on the surface of the earth. I could scarcely succeed. Hamburg, the house in the Königstrasse, my poor Grauben, all that busy world underneath which I was wandering about, was passing in rapid confusion before my terrified memory. I could revive with vivid reality all the incidents of our voyage, Iceland, Monsieur Fridriksson, Snaefell. I said to myself that if, in such a position as I was now in, I was fool enough to cling to one glimpse of hope, it would be madness, and that the best thing I could do was to despair. What human power could restore me to the light of the sun by rending asunder the huge arches of rock which united over my head, buttressing each other with impregnable strength? Who could place my feet on the right path and bring me back to my company? "Oh, my uncle," burst from my lips in the tone of despair. It was my only word of reproach, for I knew how much he must be suffering in seeking me, wherever he might be. When I saw myself thus far removed from all earthly help, I had recourse to heavenly succour. The remembrance of my childhood, the recollection of my mother, whom I had only known in my tender early years, came back to me, and I knelt in prayer, imploring for the divine help of which I was so little worthy. This return of trust in God's providence allayed the turbulence of my fears, and I was enabled to concentrate upon my situation all the force of my intelligence. I had 3 days' provisions with me, and my flask was full, but I could not remain alone for long. Should I go up or down? Up, of course. Up continually. I must thus arrive at the point where I had left the stream, that fatal turn in the road. With the stream at my feet, I might hope to regain the summit of Snaefell. Why had I not thought of that sooner? Here was evidently a chance of safety. The most pressing duty was to find out again the course of the Hansbach. I rose, and leaning upon my iron-pointed stick, I ascended the gallery. The slope was rather steep. I walked on without hope, but without indecision, like a man who has made up his mind. For half an hour I met with no obstacle. I tried to recognise my way by the form of the tunnel, by the projections of certain rocks, by the disposition of the fractures, but no particular sign appeared, and I soon saw that this gallery could not bring me back to the turning point. It came to an abrupt end. I struck against an impenetrable wall and fell down upon the rock. Unspeakable despair then seized upon me. I lay, overwhelmed, aghast. My last hope was shattered against this granite wall. Lost in this labyrinth, whose windings crossed each other in all directions, It was no use to think of flight any longer. Here I must die the most dreadful of deaths. And strange to say, the thought came across me that when some day my petrified remains should be found 30 leagues below the surface in the bowels of the earth, the discovery might lead to grave scientific discussions. I tried to speak, but hoarse sounds alone passed my dry lips. I panted for breath. In the midst of my agony, a new terror laid hold of me. In falling, my lamp had got wrong. I could not set it right, and its light was paling and would soon disappear altogether. I gazed painfully upon the luminous current growing weaker and weaker in the wire coil. A dim procession of moving shadows seemed slowly unfolding down the darkening walls. I scarcely dared to shut my eyes for one moment, for fear of losing the least glimmer of this precious light. Every instant it seemed about to vanish, and the dense blackness to come rolling in palpably upon me. One last trembling glimmer shot feebly up. I watched it in trembling and anxiety. I drank it in as if I could preserve it, concentrating upon it the full power of my eyes as upon the very last sensation of light which they were ever to experience, and the next moment I lay in the heavy gloom of deep, thick, unfathomable darkness. A terrible cry of anguish burst from me. Upon earth, in the midst of the darkest night, light never abdicates its functions altogether. It is still subtle and diffusive, but whatever little there may be, the eye still catches that little. Here there was not an atom. The total darkness made me totally blind. Then I began to lose my head. I arose with my arms stretched out before me, attempting painfully to feel my way. I began to run wildly, hurrying through the inextricable maze, still descending, still running through the substance of the earth's thick crust, a struggling denizen of geological faults, crying, shouting, yelling, soon bruised by contact with the jagged rock, falling and rising again bleeding, trying to drink the blood which covered my face, and even waiting for some rock to shatter my skull against. I shall never know whither my mad career took me. After the lapse of some hours, no doubt exhausted, I fell like a lifeless lump at the foot of the wall, and lost all consciousness. Chapter 28. The Rescue in the Whispering Gallery. When I returned to partial life, my face was wet with tears. How long that state of insensibility had lasted, I cannot say. I had no means now of taking account of time. Never was solitude equal to this. Never had any living being been so utterly forsaken. After my fall, I had lost a good deal of blood. I felt it flowing over me. Ah, how happy I should have been could I have died, and if death were not yet to be gone through. I would think no longer. I drove away every idea, and conquered by my grief, I rolled myself to the foot of the opposite wall. Already I was feeling the approach of another faint, and was hoping for complete annihilation, when a loud noise reached me. It was like the distant rumble of continuous thunder, and I could hear its sounding undulations rolling far away into the remote recesses of the abyss. Whence could this noise proceed? It must be some phenomenon proceeding in the great depths amidst which I lay helpless. Was it an explosion of gas? Was it the fall of some mighty pillar of the globe? I listened still. I wanted to know if the noise would be repeated. A quarter of an hour passed away. Silence reigned in this gallery. I could not hear even the beating of my heart. Suddenly my ear, resting by chance against the wall, caught, or seemed to catch, certain vague, indescribable, distant, articulate sounds as of words. This is a delusion, I thought. But it was not. Listening more attentively, I heard in reality a murmuring of voices, but my weakness prevented me from understanding what the voices said. Yet it was language, I was sure of it. For a moment I feared the words might be my own, brought back by the echo. Perhaps I had been crying out unknown to myself. I closed my lips firmly and laid my ear against the wall again. Yes, truly, someone is speaking. Those are words. Even a few feet from the wall I could hear distinctly. I succeeded in catching uncertain, strange, undistinguishable words. They came as if pronounced in low murmured whispers. The word Fullerad was several times repeated in a tone of sympathy and sorrow. "Help!" I cried with all my might. "Help!" I listened. I watched in the darkness for an answer, a cry, a mere breath of sound, but nothing came. Some minutes passed. A whole world of ideas had opened in my mind. I thought that my weakened voice could never penetrate to my companions. "It is they," I repeated. "What other men can be 30 leagues underground?" I again began to listen. Passing my ear over the wall from one place to another, I found the point where the voices seemed to be the best heard. The word Fullerad again returned. then the rolling of thunder, which had roused me from my lethargy. "No," I said. "No, it is not through such a mass that a voice can be heard. I am surrounded by granite walls, and the loudest explosion could never be heard here. This noise comes along the gallery. There must be here some remarkable exercise of acoustic laws." I listened again, and this time, yes, this time, I did distinctly hear my name pronounced across the wide interval. It was my uncle's own voice. He was talking to our guide, and "Follerad" is a Danish word. Then I understood it all. To make myself heard, I must speak along this wall, which would conduct the sound of my voice just as wire conducts electricity. But there was no time to lose. If my companions moved but a few steps away, the acoustic phenomenon would cease. I therefore approached the wall and pronounced these words as clearly as possible. "Uncle Liedenbrock." I waited with the deepest anxiety. Sound does not travel with great velocity. Even increased density air has no effect upon its rate of travelling. It merely augments its intensity. Seconds, which seemed ages, passed away, and at last these words reached me. "Axel? Axel, is it you?" Yes, I replied. "My boy, where are you?" "Lost in the deepest darkness." "Where is your lamp?" "It is out." "And the stream?" "Disappeared." Axel, take courage." "Wait, I'm exhausted. I can't answer. Speak to me." "Courage," resumed my uncle. "Don't speak, listen to me. We have looked for you up the gallery and down the gallery. Could not find you. I wept for you, my poor boy. At last, supposing you were still on the Hansback, we fired our guns. Our voices are audible to each other, but our hands cannot touch. But don't despair, Axel. It is a great thing that we can hear each other." During this time I had been reflecting. A vague hope was returning to my heart. There was one thing I must know to begin with. I placed my lips close to the wall, saying, "My uncle." "My boy," came to me after a few seconds. "We must know how far we are apart." "That is easy." "You have your chronometer?" "Yes." "Well, take it. Pronounce my name, noting exactly the second when you speak. I'll repeat it as soon as it shall come to me, and you'll observe the exact moment when you get my answer." "Yes, and half the time between my call and your answer will exactly indicate that which my voice will take in coming to you." "Just so, my uncle." "Are you ready?" "Yes." "Now attention, I'm going to call your name." I put my ear to the wall, and as soon as the name Axel came, I immediately replied, "Axel," then waited. 40 seconds, said my uncle. 40 seconds between the two words, so the sound takes 20 seconds in coming. Now at the rate of 1,120 feet in a second, this is 22,400 feet, or 4 miles and a quarter, nearly. 4 miles and a quarter, I murmured. It will soon be over, Axel. Must I go up or down? Down, for this reason. We are in a vast chamber with endless galleries. Yours must lead into it, for it seems as if all the clefts and fractures of the globe radiated round this vast cavern. So get up and begin walking. Walk on, drag yourself along. If necessary, slide down the steep places, and at the end you will find us ready to receive you. Now begin moving. These words cheered me up. Goodbye, uncle, I cried. I'm going. There'll be no more voices heard when once I have started, so goodbye. Goodbye, Axel. Au revoir. These were the last words I heard. This wonderful underground conversation, carried on with a distance of 4 miles and a quarter between us, concluded with these words of hope. I thanked God from my heart, for it was He who had conducted me through those vast solitudes to the point where, alone of all others perhaps, the voices of my companions could have reached me. This acoustic effect is easily explained on scientific grounds. It arose from the concave form of the gallery and the conducting power of the rock. There are many examples of this propagation of sounds which remains unheard in the intermediate space. I remember that a similar phenomenon has been observed in many places, amongst others on the internal surface of the gallery of the Dome of St. Paul's in London, and especially in the midst of the curious caverns among the quarries near Syracuse, the most wonderful of which is called Dionysus's Ear. These remembrances came into my mind, and I clearly saw that since my uncle's voice really reached me, there could be no obstacle between us. Following the direction by which the sound came, of course I should arrive in his presence, if my strength did not fail me. I therefore rose. I rather dragged myself than walked. The slope was rapid, and I slid down. Soon the swiftness of the descent increased horribly, and threatened to become a fall. I no longer had the strength to stop myself. Suddenly there was no ground under me. I felt myself revolving in air, striking and rebounding against the craggy projections of a vertical gallery. Quite a well. My head struck sharp a corner of the rock, and I became unconscious. Chapter 29. Thalatta, Thalatta. When I came to myself, I was stretched in half-darkness, covered with thick coats and blankets. My uncle was watching over me to discover the least sign of life. At my first sigh, he took my hand. When I opened my eyes, he uttered a cry of joy. "He lives! He lives!" he cried. "Yes, I'm still alive," I answered feebly. "My dear nephew," said my uncle, pressing me to his breast, "you are saved." I was deeply touched with the tenderness of his manner as he uttered these words, and still more with the care with which he had watched over me, but such trials were wanted to bring out the professor's tenderer qualities. At this moment Hans came. He saw my hand in my uncle's, and I may safely say there was joy in his countenance. "God dag," said he. "How do you do, Hans? How are you? And now, uncle, tell me where we are at the present moment." "Tomorrow, Axel, tomorrow. Now you are too faint and weak. I have bandaged your head with compresses which must not be disturbed. Sleep now, and tomorrow I will tell you all." "But do tell me what time it is, and what day." "It is Sunday, the 8th of August, and it is 10 at night. You must ask me no more questions until the 10th. In truth, I was very weak, and my eyes involuntarily closed. I wanted a good night's rest, and I therefore went off to sleep, with the knowledge that I had been 4 long days alone in the heart of the earth. Next morning, on awakening, I looked round me. My couch, made up of all our travelling gear, was in a charming grotto, adorned with splendid stalactites, and the soil of which was a fine sand. It was half light. There was no torch, no lamp, yet certain mysterious glimpses of light came from without through a narrow opening in the grotto. I heard, too, a vague and indistinct noise, something like the murmuring of waves breaking upon a shingly shore, and at times I seemed to hear the whistling of the wind. I wondered whether I was awake, whether I was dreaming, whether my brain, crazed by my fall, was not affected by imaginary noises, yet neither eyes nor ears could be so utterly deceived. "It is a ray of daylight," I thought, "sliding in through this cleft in the rock. That is indeed the murmuring of waves. That is the rustling noise of wind. Am I quite mistaken, or have we returned to the surface of the earth? Has my uncle given up the expedition, or is it happily terminated?" I was asking myself these unanswerable questions when the professor entered. "Good morning, Axel," he cried cheerily. "I feel sure you are better." "Yes, I am indeed," said I, sitting up on my couch. "You can hardly fail to be better, for you have slept quietly. Hans and I watched you by turns, and we have noticed you are evidently recovering." "Indeed, I do feel a great deal better, and I will give you a proof of that presently if you will let me have my breakfast." "You shall eat, lad. The fever has left you. Hans rubbed your wounds with some ointment or other, of which the Icelanders keep the secret, and they have healed marvellously. Our hunter is a splendid fellow." Whilst he went on talking, my uncle prepared a few provisions, which I devoured eagerly, notwithstanding his advice to the contrary. All the while I was overwhelming him with questions which he answered readily. I then learnt that my providential fall had brought me exactly to the extremity of an almost perpendicular shaft, and as I had landed in the midst of an accompanying torrent of stones, the least of which would have been enough to crush me, the conclusion was that a loose portion of the rock had come down with me. This frightful conveyance had thus carried me into the arms of my uncle, where I fell bruised, bleeding, and insensible. "Truly, it is wonderful that you have not been killed 100 times over. But for the love of God, don't let us ever separate again, or we may never see each other more." "Not separate? Is the journey not over, then?" I opened a pair of astonished eyes, which immediately called for the question. "What is the matter, Axel?" "I have a question to ask you. You say that I am safe and sound." "No doubt you are." "And all my limbs unbroken?" "Certainly." "And my head?" "Your head, except for a few bruises, is all right, and it is on your shoulders, where it ought to be." "Well, I'm afraid my brain is affected." "Your mind affected?" "Yes, I fear so. Are we again on the surface of the globe?" "No, certainly not." "Then I must be mad, for don't I see the light of day, and don't I hear the wind blowing, and the sea breaking on the shore?" "Ah, is that all?" "Do tell me all about it." "I can't explain the inexplicable, but you will soon see and understand that geology has not yet learnt all it has to learn." "Then let us go," I answered quickly. No, Axel, the open air might be bad for you. Open air? Yes, the wind is rather strong. You must not expose yourself. But I assure you I am perfectly well. A little patience, my nephew. A relapse might get us into trouble, and we have no time to lose, for the voyage may be a long one. The voyage? Yes, rest today, and tomorrow we will set sail. Set sail? And I almost leaped up. What did it all mean? Had we a river, a lake, a sea to depend upon? Was there a ship at our disposal in some underground harbour? My curiosity was highly excited. My uncle vainly tried to restrain me. When he saw that my impatience was doing me harm, he yielded. I dressed in haste. For greater safety, I wrapped myself in a blanket and came out of the grotto.